Liz Truss, the current Prime Minister, took office with the goal of recovering the British economy and setting the nation on a path to lengthy growth. The pound fell to record lows, mortgage rates surged, and the country's financial stability was put in jeopardy by bond market instability throughout her reign. The UK's GDP growth rate has varied over the past several decades between the lower rate of the Eurozone and the lower rate of the United States. This circumstance is altering, according to ING Research's global head of macroeconomics, Karsten Brzezinski. The pandemic's aftermath in Britain has been unusually sluggish. Although it is true that a number of the UK's challenges are shared by those of its neighbors and biggest trading partner, some research suggests that the country has an unusually poor outcome. In this video, we will tell you more about Britain's economic challenges. 1. First to bleed, last to mend. The UK is now in a recession, according to the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt and the Office for Budget Responsibility. The Office for National Statistics reports that for the 3 months ending in September 2022, British production decreased by 0.2%. In contrary, the Eurozone had a 0.2% gain in output, with increases of 0.2% and 0.3% respectively in France and Germany. In the same time frame, the US economy grew by 0.6%. 2. Economic background. In many ways, Britain's bigger economic issues mirror those already seen in the US and across Europe as a consequence of the pandemic and the Ukrainian crisis. Rising inflation, surging energy prices, and a lack of employment opportunities. Yet, the United Kingdom has a second Achilles heel that it developed, and that is Brexit. Foreign investment stopped after the 2016 vote to leave the EU. And trade with the EU, the nation's biggest trading partner, slowed until the country actually left the Union at the beginning of 2020. Britain changed from being a participant in the biggest trade club in the world to an outsider. Brexit would ultimately reduce the UK's gross domestic product by 4%, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, a federal institution that provides unbiased study of state finances, which is a greater cost than the pandemic. 3. More economic challenges to face. COVID-19. At least a piece of the reason for Hunt and the Office for Budget Responsibility's demise may be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic's devastating effects. The Office for Budget Responsibility predicts that the UK will achieve pre-epidemic economic levels by the end of 2024. However, the Office for National Statistics estimates the overall economic production in the UK would be 0.4% lower than it was before the pandemic. Until Britain returns to wealth, the OBR forecasts a 2% decline in GDP. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the US gross domestic product has increased by 4.2% since the pandemic, whereas the GDP of the Eurozone has increased by 2.1% since the end of 2019. Unemployment. According to the most recent data from the United Kingdom, for the 3 months ending in September 2022, unemployment was 3.6%, which is rather low when compared to other wealthy nations. It will reach 5% in 2024 as predicted by the International Monetary Fund in its October 2022 forecast. This is a little less than the forecasted 5.4% for the US, less than what was anticipated for France, Italy, and Canada, but more than what was anticipated for Germany at 3.2%. Increasing inactivity. In comparison to many of its international counterparts, the UK labor market is very tight, according to Marcel Alexandrovich of Saltmarsh Economics. Because businesses need to charge more to recruit and retain workers, having fewer workers available might cause inflation. Nevertheless, there is another problem in the UK. People of working age leaving the labor force and being labeled as inactive. While the UK has traditionally had a lower percentage of inactivity than some of its neighbors in the Eurozone, this number has substantially increased throughout the epidemic. 4. Global economic challenges faced by the world, including Britain. The UK's troubles are shared by many other countries, which is what is causing the current depressing state of the world economy. During a lengthy period of unusually low rates, most countries assumed interest rates would rise. This process is known as the normalization of monetary policy. So far, a sharp increase in inflation as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and supply chain worries from the epidemic era have forced main central banks to significantly tighten monetary policy by swiftly boosting interest rates. These rate hikes and central banks' tightening of monetary policy have the ability to disrupt the economy and the budget significantly. In fact, the dollar has increased by much more than 13% as a result of the U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet falling from a peak of $8.97 trillion in April 2022. In conjunction with robust currencies like the yen, the pound sterling, and the euro, all of which have depreciated dramatically against the U.S. dollar, this has caused problems for the currencies of developing nations. This has worsened inflationary pressures, particularly in the Eurozone and the UK. But it also affects sovereign bond rates, endangering the stability of these countries' economies. In addition, interest rates have more than doubled since August 2022. 5. Economic consequences for the British economy. The United Kingdom places in the middle of the league when considering productivity growth between 2011 and 2019. This measures the output per worker hour. It is a form of growth that doesn't lead to inflation, and authorities place a high focus on it. According to OECD data, the UK's productivity increased by 0.7% between 2011 and 2019, matching that of France and Germany, and outpacing Japan's 0.4% increase. Nevertheless, the UK's productivity growth lagged behind that of the US and Spain, which increased by 0.8% and 0.9% respectively. Also, a decline in the value of the pound would make imports relatively expensive in the near term, pushing up living costs and inflation for an island nation that imports more than 50% of its food, petrol, and other essentials. Experts predict that in reaction, the Bank of England would increase interest rates, putting it in the peculiar position of trying to speed the government's engine as it is trying to push the tires. Although analysts have compared the United Kingdom to a developing economy, or, as former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers put it, a collapsing market, and Britain's status as one of the top economies worldwide may provide some security that British people lack. The G7's second lowest debt-to-GDP ratio belongs to the United Kingdom, and unlike in underdeveloped countries, it is issued in the native currency. Although if Greek and Italian debt had appeared fortunate due to British bonds, a real financial failure is seen to be quite unlikely. The markets are becoming uneasy despite this. Politically, this is a nightmare, said David G. Blanchflower, a professor of economics at Dartmouth College, who mentioned that this is a massive vote of no confidence from the markets. The United Kingdom is dealing with a global trend that is moving the economic gravitational pull away from its economy in specific. The UK's GDP dropped from being stronger than China's to being about 9 times weaker in considerably less than 2 decades. Also, the pound is no longer as important as the US dollar. Therefore, financial markets will punish it severely if it deviates significantly from the standard. The newly elected UK government faces a significant job in restoring global investor confidence in its financial stability, despite a new prime minister who is generally considered as a strong grip. 6. Experts' opinions on the economic situation of Britain. According to a number of economists, the United Kingdom is causing its own particular problem. Marshall Alexandrovich of Saltmarsh Economics stated that it looks like it is long-term sickness rather than just some long COVID at play. There's a mounting problem with healthcare backlogs that's adding to the lack of flexibility in the UK labor market, on top of Brexit's impact on migration. According to David Hennig, director of the UK's Trade Policy Project at the European Centre for International Political Economics, the UK's economic climate was already unstable as a result of Brexit. Freya Beamish, chief economist at TS Lombard, claims that one major factor contributing to the subpar productivity growth has been the attempt to foster development by sizable investment promises, while yet adhering to strict borrowing restrictions. Beamish mentioned that economies are multidimensional and Brexit was binary, so remainders are overly gloomy and Brexiters were overly optimistic, and the truth is somewhere in between. And added, but policymakers lacking vision and desperate to tick boxes that they themselves have created will condemn the economy to a worse than necessary outcome. According to a report by the International Monetary Fund, UK families were predicted to experience higher financial pressure than their counterparts in Western Europe, as a result of inadequate insulation and a heavy dependence on gas to heat homes during Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February. In response, the UK government said a few months ago that it should be prepared to step in and subsidize energy rates for individuals and businesses. This might be the biggest economic intervention by the government in centuries. According to independent research group Institute for Fiscal Studies, the move will cost about $108 billion in the coming year. Conclusion. The Bank of England and many others predict that this is simply the first of several successive quarters that will herald the start of a protracted crisis. Looking back, it is quite concerning that the UK economy remains poorer today than it was just before the pandemic that took place 3 years ago. The United Kingdom isn't simply the primary giant that will be losing ground in the 3 months leading up to September 2022. It also occurs to represent the sole nation that has not made a full recovery to the portion of its GDP that was lost to the epidemic. The UK GDP is surprisingly still 0.4% lower than it was in the quarter before the epidemic in 2019. This is shocking.